it to any of you. I note that we have 5 commissioners so far. Okay, we have, and we expect 2 via Zoom, so we should be up to our full quorum in a minute. Here we go, 1. And we'll continue on when the second gets, or after, and not wait for the second. Announcements, staff announcements?
And there's a couple things to announce. Tomorrow, Wednesday, from 5 to 7 at the Ashland Library, there's a community resource fair, which is being put on by the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee. So people are encouraged to attend for information about housing or utility assistance and other programs available. Additionally, I wanted to let this commission know that your April 22nd regular study session, you'll be joined by the City Council. It's on their look ahead now for a joint study session to discuss the economic opportunity analysis and the potentially Southern Oregon University master plan. We're reaching out to SOU to see if they'd be available at that meeting in order to take advantage of both bodies being present. I also wanted to note that at the last City Council meeting on February 18th, the City Council approved a carbon pollution impact fee, which would go into effect in January of 2026. They also approved Ordinance 3245, which is the amendments to Chapter 2.11, the committee's rules in terms of universal standards for advisory committees. I also wanted to note that the March 4th meeting of the City Council, the Council will be hearing an appeal of the Planning Commission's decision to approve the Kestrel subdivision. So that is an on-the-record appeal that was appealed by individuals within the neighborhood. And that is it. I would also, I guess, note that following the storm, the city has now suspended enforcement of hazard tree removal to allow individuals to remove trees that were specifically damaged by the snow, not just a tree that is buckling the sidewalk for the last 5 years. That would still have to go through the process, but if trees were significantly damaged during the storm, that enforcement is suspended through April 30th to allow people to recover. And that's all I have.
Okay, well, that's a wide variety of things. And I don't see anybody out there in the public, so we're going to skip over public forum to unfinished business. And it is approval of findings for PA-T1-2024-00255 at 110 Terrace Street,
And then when
which is the request for formal
when the agenda item
interpretation.
comes up, I'll just
Could
steal
whoever's,
off and then you don't have to worry
Chairman,
about
if you
audio
could
and all
mute,
that.
Chairman.
could you mute your microphone, please?
Turn up that a little bit.
Thank you. And this is the request for formal interpretation of the Ashland Land Use Code, Land Use Ordinance, as it applies to how a peer respite home, as defined by ORS 430.626, is regulated. We have before us a copy of the findings, and these are the same findings that were sent out to us earlier this week, in case you didn't have a chance to copy them. So before we start, have any commissioners had any ex parte contacts on this issue? Commissioner Herron?
No.
Commissioner Kenkaran?
No.
Commissioner McCracken-Chen?
No.
Commissioner Mars not here? Commissioner Perkinson?
No.
Commissioner Phillips?
No.
And I have not either, so we've satisfied that. And anybody have any questions about the findings?
I have a procedural question.
Sure.
So we are being asked here to approve the findings as a representation of what was found in the meeting, correct? As opposed to agreement with the findings. Because
We are-
that agreement was already had in the last meeting, correct?
We are formally approving, agreeing to approving the findings and conclusions that are written here to make sure that they are what we remember them to be at last meeting.
Okay. Because I still disagree, but I'm not voting, this is not a vote on that.
No.
Correct.
This is just,
Okay.
does this represent what we said at the last meeting?
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome. So, that being said, is there a motion?
I move to approve the findings and conditions as presented.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
And is there any discussion? Michael, will you call the roll?
Commissioner Perkinson,
Aye.
Commissioner McCracken-Jen,
Aye.
Commissioner Phillips,
Aye.
Commissioner Kincairn,
Aye.
Commissioner Herron,
Aye.
Chair Werner.
Aye. Okay, that has been adopted. We'll move on to discussion items. We have two of them before us. One is Climate-Friendly Areas Code Update, and second is Walkable Design Standards Code Update. And we have the consultants with us. Brandon?
Yeah, we're fortunate tonight to have consultants present both for the Climate-Friendly Area Code Update discussion and the Walkable Design Standards, namely 3J and JET Planning for the Climate-Friendly Area discussion, and Cascadia Partners are present to discuss the Walkable Design Standards. I also wanted to acknowledge as part of this that the city, or the state of Oregon passed the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Act in 2022, but they also provided funding to allow communities like ours to seek grants from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and both of these projects are funded through those grant opportunities. So a special thanks to DLCD for the work that's been done. And with that, unless Derek has anything to provide, we can introduce both Scott Freganesi and Elizabeth Decker from 3J Consulting and JET Planning, respectively.
Thank you.
Hey.
Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting.
Well, thank you so much for having us tonight. Elizabeth is going to do the heavy lifting tonight, so I'm going to pass it to you to do any of the presentation. I'll be here, of course, for questions. This has been a great project. Been working on it for several months now. We're nearing the conclusion, so we hope you kind of react to the proposals we have tonight, and we have a good conversation about moving forward. So thanks. All you, Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me virtually tonight. And Scott and Brandon and Derek have been great to work with. We spoke with you all last in the fall to talk about some of the recommendations and based on what we had found in our code audit and some engagement. So it's a pleasure to be back here to share with you what we've been working on to incorporate those recommendations. Now, it wouldn't be a meeting without a presentation. So here we are for tonight, talking to you specifically about the climate-friendly area implementation piece as we move towards adoption by June. So again, Elizabeth Decker with JET Planning, and I've been working with the city on this for a little over a year now, right, Scott? Yeah. Okay, so just quick refresher, since we've been working on this, you've heard a little from other folks already. This is under the broader Climate-Friendly and Equitable Communities Program, CFEC. If you, the way I heard it, that it was taught to me was like, CFEC, what the heck? So if you need a catchy way to remember that acronym. City has already adopted parking reform. We are working on climate-friendly areas, and the city is preparing to begin the TSP update. The walkable urban design standards piece that you'll also hear about from the Cascadia Partners team, the work they're doing really spans the CFA and the TSP update phases. So hopefully great opportunity tonight to see how those will be linked up. But specifically for this phase of the work, the charge was, based on the CFAC rules, for Ashland to designate one or more climate-friendly areas, a CFA, and update the zoning code and maps and/or comprehensive plan as needed in order to implement that CFA. So there was some work done in 2023 that we started with. We've worked through the code analysis, a market study, community engagement that we have shared with you. And now we are into the last phase of the work, which is actually updating the codes to reflect all that study and background and preferred direction in order to bring it back to you for adoption. So tonight is a work session to share with you the draft code. It is a work in progress. So we're looking for some feedback and also to refine a few areas before beginning that adoption process. The proposal is to focus on 2 climate-friendly areas, what termed the railroad property north of downtown, and a portion of what's currently in the transit triangle overlay. The direction for the railroad property was to really take advantage of it being near downtown, having a mix of different development types, and that the existing development there, the employment and residential overlay, really, hadn't been updated for several decades, and that there was really an opportunity with the CFA code and the direction there to make a positive impact and hopefully unlock some alternative development patterns. In the transit triangle area, Ashland's been doing, sort of CFA flavored work for a long time. We just didn't have that acronym. And so a lot of the work with the transit triangle overlay and some of the other pedestrian places work and other visioning in this area is very much about a walkable mixed use place. And however, the specifics of the current transit triangle overlay hadn't really been, an appealing development package for developers. And so really saw the opportunity to refine the code approach to further support that vision in this area, consistent with Ashland's long-range planning. But, us planners, give it a different acronym, same thing, new package, or similar, I should say, a refined product by focusing in that commercial portion of the transit triangle to take advantage of its location near SOU, really can clean up some of the existing overlay language and focus in on the commercial while excluding some of the residential areas to limit the impacts of change. There was some discussion about the downtown and the Croman Mill area, and you'll see that those 2 areas were not recommended to move forward as designated climate-friendly areas. That doesn't mean that climate-friendly flavored development is not wanted in those areas. That very much is part of the character and the desired development for both those areas, but there are different tools that the city already has existing and/or is expecting to see in those areas that will help implement a slightly different flavor of climate-friendly development or whatever walkable mixed-use urban design type of format. Whichever acronym you prefer there. So specifically to Croman Mill, there's a master plan process in negotiation with the applicant underway right now. And so if that doesn't work out, the city will have this new CFA overlay that we're talking about that could be applied to that site if a different regulatory approach is needed, but that area was not needed to meet the CFA requirements at this time. And so the direction was to pause on that. Downtown being largely developed, having an existing code that already allows, pretty similar uses and scale as CFA. There just wasn't a lot of additional benefit from CFA designation here. And we heard that there was an interest to avoid conflict with the historic district standards. So focusing on the 2 areas that were proposed, moving forward with a climate-friendly area designation there means that we're looking at I guess I broke it up here as 6 key land use requirements that we're trying to implement. So first is allowing multifamily residential. Cities have the choice about whether or not to require ground floor mixed use. And so we'll talk about how that's proposed. The only exception is for affordable housing, where that has to be permitted outright without a ground floor commercial or retail or office space. Second component is to allow townhouses to have some housing variety. Third is to allow a variety of commercial, office, and civic uses, so everything from parks and schools to public-facing government uses, like, say, a library or the place you go to pay your water bill. To keep in mind, these have to be permitted. This is not about changing where City Hall and other city departments are currently located. There's no requirement to move them into the CFAs, just that if future uses were needed, if the city was looking to site them, that it would be an option to site that kind of a use there. On the scale side, CFAs are areas where, for a city of Ashland size, at least 50-foot tall buildings must be permitted, with a minimum density of 15 units per acre for those residential types, and with no maximum density applied. So that really the height and the setbacks and the overall sort of site parameters set the density rather than an arbitrary number in code. So looking at Ashland's code, when you dig into it, there's an awful lot of overlays and nuance that's there. And so the approach that is proposed combines the existing base zones, which are both commercial and employment for the 2 CFAs that are proposed. And then one of the benefits of this implementation approach in the areas that were chosen was that there's really an opportunity to simplify how the existing overlays apply within the CFAs. So as mentioned, there's an opportunity to remove the existing transit triangle overlay. That really hasn't been a compelling option, and the CFA, or the climate friendly, the CF overlay, is going to provide a lot of similar benefits for that area. In the railroad property, there is a residential overlay opportunity there to remove it. As I said, it hasn't really been updated in a couple decades, and so the scale of development is really not as robust as is envisioned for CFAs. So there's an opportunity to clean that up. And then to expand the detail site review overlay that has a slightly lower threshold for when new projects would come before the Planning Commission for review, and also some additional design standards for the site and for buildings. That detail site review, as it turns out, covers most of these 2 CFAs already. And so the proposal was, rather than sort of bifurcate parts of it, to fully expand it so that it also includes areas outside the CFAs, but within the CFAs to be congruent with the borders. And then for those CFAs to introduce the new climate-friendly overlay that'll do sort of the regulatory heavy lifting by superseding the base zones. And this will be done through map and code updates. So when we think about the railroad property, again, this is, we're talking about an employment-based zone. That does not change, but the residential overlay goes away and is replaced with the climate-friendly overlay, and the detail site review overlay gets expanded. In the transit triangle CFA, the existing base zoning for commercial and employment stays the same. The transit triangle overlay goes away, is replaced by the climate-friendly overlay. The pedestrian places overlay can go away. It's superseded also by the climate-friendly overlay. And then the detail site review overlay is slightly expanded. You'll also notice there's some areas in turquoisey, greenish along Siskiyou Boulevard that are currently within the transit triangle overlay that are not proposed to be part of the new CFA. These areas have base zoning that's R2 and R3, so more intense residential development. However, the prevailing character is really consistent with the R2 and R3 zoning. There's not a lot of vacant parcels there, and so again, no one's used the transit triangle overlay there, and so the proposal is to maintain the base zoning without overlays in that area, that it would not be compatible with the goals for the climate-friendly area. So the key features for this new climate-friendly overlay can really think of it in terms of like adjusting the uses. If you go back to those 6 main principles, the first 3 have to do with uses, and the second 3 have to do with dimensions. So on the use side, the new CFA overlay that will supersede the base zone commercial and employment zones will allow those townhouses, the attached single-family dwellings, with some frontage requirements that we'll talk about, allow multifamily dwellings with an exception for affordable housing to be permitted outright without mixed use, allow retail and restaurants are not currently permitted at the full scale in the commercial and employment zone, mostly in the employment zone. Sort of an interesting quirk is that drive-throughs are permitted within the transit triangle along Ashland Street. And although drive-through or drive-up, I believe is the term in the code, drive-up uses and climate-friendly walkable design aren't necessarily 2 things you think of in the same sentence. That really is the area that the city's carved out for those leading up to the freeway, and that there are already some pretty strict limitations on a cap on how many drive-throughs can exist and how those have to be designed. And so the direction proposed is to keep those existing limitations, which allows the existing drive-throughs in the Transit Triangle CFA and possibly relocated ones in that area. Adding both schools and parks there, and then we'll talk about some options to consider limiting some auto-oriented and large-scale uses that are permitted in the commercial and employment zone right now, but maybe aren't the best fit in the CFA itself. Or the CFAs, I should say. On the dimension side, adding some minimum density for both of those zones. The requirement is 15, but we're proposing a slightly higher 25 units per acre in the commercial area to really encourage any residential development to be built like in a way that is more efficient and really maximizes the site and contributes to walkability, really with an eye towards, not wanting lower density townhouses to take up some of the prime retail and commercial shopping areas. There's some exceptions for mixed use. If you're adding it above something, it doesn't have to meet the minimum density. There's no maximum density. Again, it's what fits on the site. There's some minimum FAR proposed that is just to make sure that there's some significant building presence and a good use of the site. There are no minimum setbacks in the commercial or employment zone, so that's proposed for the CF overlay. We'll talk about how to incorporate solar setbacks and some trade-offs there. There's also some discussion, we'll talk about step backs on upper stories, increasing the maximum height for the commercial and employment zones. It's currently 40 feet, and so going up to 50 to meet the specifics for the state rules, and then allowing an outright bonus up to 60 feet for affordable housing or whatever's permitted through state rules, at the applicant's discretion. That may be greater. Those state rules, it's state statute, it always applies. But it could be easier for someone if they're just looking for the 10 feet to use that aspect of code. So we heard there was a lot of interest in promoting affordable housing in some of our previous discussions. So wanted to include that in the code. And then another specificity to the CFAs is the Ashland Code allows block lengths 300 to 400 feet, and we just needed to add a specificity that 350 is the maximum block length within CFAs. The other third principle of design or of zoning is dimensions, is design. Sorry, excuse me a little. Working from home, it's always an interesting challenge, is design. And so, as I mentioned, the detailed site design review is going to be the main place that Ashland applies its existing standards. And you'll also hear more about walkable urban design tonight. All right, so that brings us to really going through the discussion part of our presentation. I've got sort of 4 topic areas for your feedback on, but maybe first, any questions or clarifications on what we've discussed so far?
I'm just curious and naive, obviously, about the block length issue. What are the reasons for them to be shorter and what are the reasons for them to be longer? I mean, what's the effect, the goal?
The goal of the CFA standards or of the city's existing standards?
Now, how does CFA relate to the 350-foot block length?
Yeah, so the direction there, or the concept is that if there are shorter blocks, it's easier to, as a pedestrian, to get where you're going, that you don't have to, go way down to the end of a really long block in order to loop around and come back, so that you can have more direct routes of getting where you need to go.
And that also, but then it also compresses the amount of area that you can have dense housing.
Yeah, there are some impacts.
Okay.
Anybody
I think
else?
for the city, you're already at 300 to 400, and so this is really the existing average. I don't think it's going to be a big change for Ashland.
No, I was just curious about
Yeah.
the reasons behind it, that's all.
Yeah, good question.
Susan?
I was curious about the comments with regard to food manufacturing in particular, since that has been declared, as I understand things, as a strategy for Ashland by the Chamber of Commerce, and we have a number of notable artisanal food businesses in Ashland, and I'm aware of at least one that's looking at, potentially moving into the transportation triangle. So I was just curious about the thinking in that regard.
Yeah, we'll talk a little about that, but the thinking there is that right now in the commercial zone, there's a limitation of only 600 square feet, I believe, of manufacturing space for a food products manufacturing type business, and there is no size limit in the employment zone. So that could be just fine. As you mentioned, that could be a really viable and desired industry in Ashland, and that's exactly why we're having these conversations to talk about other goals beyond just the CFA, but also for introducing more residential uses into CFAs, just having this discussion about how that might balance out. Some of the other stood out to me, some of the other limitations on food manufacturing had to do with like fermented products within a certain number of feet of a residential zone, and just thinking how there could be more residential uses in what's currently zoned E1. And, do we need to be protecting folks, or let's say managing the impacts of fermented foods on potential future residents of CFAs?
Does that answer your question?
Okay. And forgive me if I'm still in catch-up mode here.
Yeah.
There's
That's why we're on work
townhouses. What should I know about Ashland, and what comes across as a clear antipathy about townhouses?
I think I might be able to address, historically, we saw a lot of townhouse development in our R2 and R3 residential zones, and less multifamily apartments. However, within our E1 and C1, our commercial zones, mixed use was allowable, but single-use residential has not historically been allowable in those zones. So you would see commercial ground floors, some percentage of the ground floor, and we'll talk about that tonight as well, with the upstairs being residential uses. So again, I think that we have the R1 3.5 zone, which was intentionally designed to accommodate townhomes. I think that, one of the issues of consumption of employment and commercial land really gets to economic opportunity. If you consume that with residential exclusive use, you may not have an adequate supply for future commercial development. So I don't know if I'd frame it as an antipathy, but rather a right place, right type of housing development.
Anybody
All
else?
right. Oh,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds like we're already surfacing some of the issues that I, had highlighted for us to about. So I have sort of 4 key areas. I'll talk through them, and then can go back through the slides we get. But let me just give you an overview of the 4 and then turn it over to you all for discussion for the remainder of this item. So the first sort of topic area is we heard during our previous engagement and discussions with both Planning Commission and City Council is this idea that some of the ideas being proposed for the climate-friendly areas seem like good ideas in other parts of the city. So a couple specifics to come back to you for your feedback. These are both optional. Again, the CFA requirements will be met there, but if they provide inspiration elsewhere, wonderful. So one potential change would be to remove the maximum density in the C1 and E1 zones citywide. Again, the idea just being that the site is really going to control how many units can go in there, and if there is an opportunity to add a few more, are they smaller units? Are they bigger? Is there a need to limit the number of smaller units or other densities that can be achieved within all the other standards. So that was the first potential change. And then also, as I had mentioned, the downtown as a CFA, but to make sure that, it wasn't left behind, that there were similar, CFA scale development permitted in the downtown. And so the changes we highlighted that could accomplish that would be permitting multifamily dwellings outright. There's 1 or 2 sites where that might be a possibility without a mixed use requirement on the ground floor, so long as it meets a minimum density of 30 units per acre. So, pretty good return in terms of housing for that site, for a potential site to meet a variety of Ashland's housing needs. Aligning the height standards with what's proposed for the CFA, so going up to 50 feet outright, and then the option to go to 60 feet as a conditional use, and likewise removing the maximum density. So both of those are optional. And then as some of these you've already had good questions about, thinking about auto-oriented and large-scale uses in the climate-friendly areas. As I mentioned, there's no changes proposed to drive-up uses, and instead the proposal is to rely on the existing limitations and standards. There's also, in some instances, drive-up uses in this area would trigger a conditional use, so you'd have an opportunity to review. And then thinking about some other auto-oriented uses, again, there's no requirement to limit these or change them. It's just something that I noticed reading through the existing code and thinking about the overall intent and purpose of climate-friendly areas. Both automotive and truck repair or service and automotive sales and rental uses are permitted with some, Brandon, you can help me out a little. They're either permitted with limitations or permitted as conditional uses. I forget precisely, but that includes things like gas stations, car wash. Again, there are already some of these existing uses on Ashland Street. And so, there's sort of a tension between, you don't want to make them, there could be concern about making them non-conforming uses, but it's also maybe not additional uses to prioritize in a CFA. Some other uses to consider are larger scale storage uses, so both self-storage and wholesale storage, just thinking about, how much vitality are they contributing to a walkable urban sort of mixed use area. And then the third prong is, as we're already talking about food product manufacturing, general manufacturing, and I guess I pulled out cabinetry, caught my eye as well as being potentially loud or, having some impacts with residential uses. And so there could be some further limitations on these, or there could not. They could continue to be permitted. I think it's, very similar to food product manufacturing. It's really important to think about what the city's broader economic development goals are. A really significant portion of the employment and commercial zones will be located within the proposed climate-friendly overlay. And so although, potentially refining some of these could better meet a CFA intent, there are really the base zone intentions as well. There are some, there are some additional employment uses closer to the freeway, even on the east side of the freeway. Maybe that's a better place for some of these. But, maybe not. It really depends on the balance of economic development goals. Also, some questions about townhouses. And so I think that is a real change with the climate-friendly areas for Ashland. And so since they have to be permitted, I really just wanted to highlight some of the standards that will help address that built form. One of the reasons that the higher minimum density of 25 units per acre is proposed for the commercial zone is to either, frankly, encourage multifamily or to encourage smaller townhouses. So a developer would need to hit 1,750 square foot average lots to meet that minimum density, which can certainly be done. But just it's a higher, more intense form of townhouses, hopefully contributing more to the walkable neighborhood. You could have slightly larger lots in the employment zone. The city has pretty robust existing access management standards. And so when we started thinking about what would it look like to develop townhouses, I think this is going to be a real key to how and where they can get developed and what they look like. Because driveways have to be 75 to 100 feet apart for avenues and boulevards, which are the higher order streets. And if you have 1,700 square foot lots, there's no way you're spacing your driveways that far apart. It's just not feasible. Even to meet 24 feet apart for local streets, those smaller lots are not going to achieve that kind of spacing. And so that's likely to push alley-loaded townhouses, which is going to really change the look and feel of townhouses and hopefully make them more walkable by bringing those main entrances and making them street-facing townhouses with alley-loaded parking rather than a front that's really dominated by garages and driveways. So another, incentive to use alleys is proposal to have a 20-foot lot frontage exception if you do an alley, rather than the existing code standard is 40 feet. So be curious to hear, any refinements or feedback on that. And then the last area for reflection, as promised, really has to do with the site and design and some scale. So thinking about the applicability of solar setbacks within the climate-friendly overlay. The proposal is to only apply solar setbacks within 100 feet of a residential zone, so around the perimeter, really like on the north side of the railroad property, for example. Because in analyzing the solar setbacks and in talking, with developers and other folks through engagement, really heard that to get to that CFA scale at 50 feet, the setbacks that would be required for each individual lot with solar setbacks would really be prohibitive. So there were some concerns there. And then also looking at some precedent in Ashland and other zones. Oh, sorry for the typo. Croman Mill, downtown, and the C1 zone already have various standards that limit the applicability essentially to the perimeter. And so proposal was to sort of borrow that approach as well for the climate-friendly overlay. And the next piece was to talk about whether to apply some building height step backs, which is a scaling tool where buildings that are over a couple stories, in this case 2, in this example, which could be further refined. So portions of buildings over 25 feet have to be stepped back an additional 10 feet from residential. That gives you a little bit more, light and air circulating, can address the bulk, but does have some trade-offs of developability as well as, square footage. And then really thinking about if there's any other specific design goals or things that, beyond what's covered in the existing code and what you're going to hear about in the walkable urban design that you think could be appropriate for specifically the CFAs. So those are the 4 areas. Now it's time for, I'll turn it over to you and let me know if you'd like me to pull up any of these individual slides.
Thank you. Anybody want to start? Reactions to anything she said? Want to keep it all the same? Go for it.
In the future, would it be possible to get a slideshow like this before the meeting so we could review it a little bit, read it? And a lot of stuff just got thrown at us, not to mention code changes and, the walkability and all that. It would be nice to have time to review this before the meeting, for a study session especially.
I would agree with that, but in terms, I guess what I was looking for is something that was laid out exactly 1, 2, 3, 4 things that we're being asked to review and make recommendations / decisions on, so that it's, when I looked at the packet, there's a lot of stuff in here, but it isn't, I don't think it's laid out in a way that says, okay, the first decision is this, and then this, and then this. So maybe that could help next time.
Definitely we can work with the consultant team to get PowerPoint presentations in advance and to you. In large part, I think that the PowerPoint is reflective of a lot of the information in the memo, just laid out in more easily understood slides. One of the slides that Elizabeth pulled up was the optional that delineated the distinction between drive-up automotive, the storage, food manufacturing, and cabinet or construction. That might be one of the first points to discuss, and then we could discuss townhomes and then the step backs and solar. And I know there were 4 and I'm only saying 3. So perhaps that slide would illuminate that for your discussion.
Yeah, and I can pull any of those back up.
Russell, you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess if we want to go in order, we could start with the maximum density for C1 and E1. And then I think lumped in with that was the changes to downtown zoning. I think eliminating the maximum densities in the C1 and E1 would probably be in alignment with our goals for low-income housing. But I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on that.
I'm not sure that eliminating the density in C1 and E1 doesn't encourage housing in those zones. And it seems to me that we want to be a full-service community in which we have all land uses. And so that means we want some C1, some E1 zones that are not able to be residential areas. If we're going to have a multitude of, we're going to have a full range of zoning in the town. So I would be hesitant to recommend removing the density zones, density limits from C1 and E1. Eric?
Yeah, I would kind of agree. Russ, I think it's kind of a bigger question. So, I mean, maximum density E1, there's some current residential houses in E1, and, it's meant to be employment and a mix. If you remove maximum density, there's no parking required anymore. Up pops 15 homes in a really dense area. The collector streets can't handle them. We don't know if the fire department can handle, it seems like it would be easier to evaluate those projects on a variance or a type 2 planning action or something like that, where they would come to us and say, here's what we're planning, and we might have the flexibility to approve something more dense. I don't know. But to wholesalely do it, like E1's, there's a lot of E1 out there. And so I just don't know if some of those areas are quite developed enough to just say, go for it, build as much as you want. I mean, I like more housing.
Yeah, but we're sort of doing that by putting the CFA over the E1 and C1. We're saying basically go for the housing there, but I want to make sure that we have some areas that are not covered by the C1 overlay that are primarily where C1 and E1 uses then could locate. so that we do have the full range of uses available within the city. And we don't turn into just being a bedroom community.
I think that makes sense now that you put it that way.
So I like this discussion on max density, and what I wonder is if there are any case studies or examples that we can look to or point to in other cities where they've removed maximum density, and we could observe what the intended or unintended consequences of that are. Because I wonder what those consequences are, and I don't know. And I'm wondering if we have any experience that would really give us insight as to what the effects would be.
I guess I could jump in on that one. I think that there may be case studies. My hesitation to say we could find those and look at that for you is that, everywhere is very unique in terms of what that max density would be, in terms of the amount of acreage of each of those zoning types, what your market is. As we know, Ashland's really unique. So I'm just not 100% sure that if we were able to come up with something like that, it would give us ideas about what the effects could be, but not, I guess, how much or that magnitude of change that would affect it is what I'm getting at. So we could do that if we needed to, but I don't have any examples right off the top of my head.
Okay. And it may be unknowable. There may be too many variables that drive the outcomes where you can't really predict it. So, okay, thanks.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, I didn't mean to shoot down that question.
I just wonder, it feels speculative, and I think at some level it is. And I was just wondering if there was a way to fine tune that speculation.
I mean, the best case study that you're going to have is the CFAs going forward, right? Because that's exactly what you'll do. There'll be no maximum density in the areas zoned C1 and E1 for the CFAs. And so, one option, this is optional at this time. And so, maybe the direction is see how it works in the CFAs and then decide from there whether it makes sense to expand it at a later date.
So that's actually my leaning is to do the minimum and learn and not do too much right up front. But that's my leaning.
Well, I'm seeing nods around the table here, so I think that's the direction that we want to go. So let's
All right. Yeah. How about downtown? Yeah. Similar logic or an interest to I think what we'd heard from council and perhaps from some of you earlier was a concern about leaving downtown behind. And so wanting it to keep pace with the CFAs. And so that's why, this option is under consideration. But again, there's no requirement at this time.
And you're saying the option is to allow multifamily on all four,
Right.
all floors?
Right. To change the multifamily, increase the height, and remove maximum density.
Okay.
Were the key changes.
Yeah, I like increasing the maximum height, and I think right now we're restricted. We have a 40-foot limit up to 50. I think there's conditions where it could go 50 foot if the building next to it is 40 feet tall or something, and I think that inhibits downtown from really developing up and using the maximum amount and being dense for downtown. So there's a good portion, maybe 25-30% of our downtown commercial C1D buildings that are one story, and so you can't go up to 50 feet right now. The one story is not a good use of space. Also, too, something you didn't bring up on the walkability side of it, and maybe that's going to be talked about here shortly. There's a lot that folds into downtowns for walkability, i.e. the restriction on drive-throughs going forward. So there's more restrictions than Ashland has. For example, if a drive-through is not used within 1 year, it comes out of the inventory. All those things. And I don't know if we're going to talk about the walkability side of the CFA, because I think there's a lot in there that I wanted to see in downtown, because I think we lack that.
I would note there are walkability design standards that will be discussed by Cascadia that would apply citywide, both in the CFAs and in other commercial areas, as well as residential. New standards for walkability is outlined in the model code that was developed for the state to address CFEC. So definitely will be. That's next. It is.
Yeah, and maybe in the interests of getting you to that, could we move on to the next topic area, or any other comments here?
I think we do have a couple more comments. Susan?
So in general, I agree with the baby steps approach, given that this is new territory for all of us. In terms of downtown, I am in favor of not leaving it behind, so to speak. But I believe the recommendation that the Planning Commission had was to see if we can have a study done to understand better what might be needed, as opposed to jumping right into zoning changes. That said, personally, I would support multifamily outright without mixed use, because I don't see those buildings necessarily performing very well from a commercial perspective, and they are very difficult to insure. And that's probably only going to get worse going forward with my insurance hat on. And therefore, while they may be nice ideas in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or places like that, I'm not sure that they're the best solution here to make sure that we have a very vital downtown.
Russell, do you want to say something?
Yeah, for the 3 points, permitting multifamily dwellings outright, I don't think we should do that downtown. I like the idea of maintaining the historic properties and the commercial feel of the downtown. I think it's very unique. It has a very special feel to it. I'm in favor of increasing the allowed height of the buildings, and I don't feel like we should eliminate maximum densities for residential and mixed-use projects.
Susan?
And this is a point that Councillor Hyatt had approved, but I don't understand how maintaining the historical character and requiring mixed use are in conflict with each other. There seems to be an assumption that requiring mixed use commercial and residential protects the historical character, but I don't understand that logic.
I might be able to illuminate it a bit. The downtown and historic district has historic district design standards. Were the area rolled into a CFA, those design standards would not be applicable. So that gets to spacing, vertical separation between buildings, those things that Eric had mentioned that are applicable in the downtown. So I think that was part of the issue. I would note that the downtown already has a 60 unit per acre allowable density, which is much higher than has been achieved on any project in Ashland. Typically, in the case of across from the post office, you're looking at approximately 30 units, I think 29 units per acre on the development that happened, again, off of Lithia Way. So that gives you an indicator that 60 units per acre would essentially be doubling the number of units with one additional story or two.
So part of the reason I presume, I haven't thought about this before the second, is that the reason the density is lower there is because of the parking requirements. So with the parking requirements removed, that will greatly change.
So again, if we're talking about the downtown, it is never required parking. or at least not for 40 years. Zero parking was required for residential uses.
So those were all the parking places for those buildings were done
Yes.
as they wanted them?
Actually, the downtown boundary is Lithia Way, so that side of Lithia Way had parking. So they had to provide parking.
Right, that's what I thought, it was
and-
required.
And they also have a lower 30-unit density. So they went to the maximum allowed
Okay.
density. And I believe they also provided about 75 parking spaces.
A lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot, and still met the maximum density that was allowed.
So you could double that density through both going another story and doing less parking.
But that property is C1 zone, not C1D. So I
Okay.
will draw that distinction. So there it has a 30-unit maximum.
And that would stay.
That would stay unless it was applied citywide, which previously you indicated, baby steps.
Eric?
I do agree with you on that. You know, if you don't allow larger buildings and residential on those upper floors, we have a lot of buildings in this town that are barely insurable, that are not ADA accessible on the first floor, the second floor, or the third floor. And they're very difficult to even retrofit at this point due to their use over history and time. So if you are going to remove a one-story or two-story building downtown that has lived beyond its expected life and is not efficient in the ability to use it as a commercial space or residential, when you allow to go higher, you increase the ability for a developer to actually do that and not just more or less abandon the building that's there because it still holds a tiny bit of value. There would be more of an upside if you were able to densify it and to use that space for residential, commercial, put a rooftop bar, whatever you want to do. It makes it more developable. If you have the standard where you can only go up one story above your neighbor, it stagnates a lot of things in downtown.
So are you saying 60 feet across the downtown is good?
Yeah, that'd be great. I wouldn't be opposed to starting at 50 feet. Or the ones that you just brought up, I think those are capped at 40 feet, aren't they? And so, and once again, I understand they're across
And
the
there's
street
a-
from C1D.
And there's 55-foot height through a CUP versus outright permitted 60, which was part of the proposal, with the potential of getting a CUP to increase beyond that.
A typical story is 15 feet.
Okay.
You have 10 feet of ceiling space, and then you got some mechanical space. So 60 feet allows
stories.
four stories.
Okay.
Yeah. 50 feet allows, 3
Three and a half.
stories.
Okay, so, to my way of thinking, I think 4 stories would be fine downtown. And I guess I don't see that if we have a 60-unit per acre max on density, I'm not sure that that makes much difference than just removing the density. So I guess I would,
So remove the density but cap the height.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I would also have it be mixed use, so that, I like the feel and look of a commercial space on the bottom and then residences above it. That's me.
But not if they're all empty. Look at Lithia Way. It's just not working, if you ask me. It looks appealing if you could imagine it full, but.
Well,
you know.
and that's why I think we need the economic study, is to know why uses aren't going in the spaces, and whether it's just simply a matter of well, if we'd let them on the first floor, if we didn't require them to go on the first floor, then all the other buildings would be full.
What's the reason?
Yeah.
Just a thought process. Developments like those don't happen overnight. So you might get one or two in a period of 5 years. You have time to make adjustments. If you start seeing that it's all gone residential downtown and all the business has to move out, but if more people move downtown, then that's going to increase the opportunity for the restaurants or the retail stores or the office buildings or the schools or the banks or whatever. They have more people to cater to than what they have right now.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And if we go the direction more walkable, they're not going to be driving their car, so they're going to be
Walking to the restaurant.
participating more in commerce.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is we increase the heights to 60 feet downtown, remove the maximum density, and continue with mixed use. Is that what I'm hearing?
Good job.
Okay, okay.
I don't agree with the continuing mixed use, but I may be the outlier. I think we need to know more
Yeah,
to make informed decisions.
well, so I'm glad we're having this study session with council.
It'll be on the economic opportunity analysis draft. It's not a completed document, so
Okay.
there'll
Well,
be
it's
more
a
to come
start.
on that.
Sure.
So for mixed-use projects right now, what's the current maximum amount of residential you can have on the bottom floor in downtown?
It depends on the area in the transit triangle. It's 65% residential, 35% commercial. Everywhere else, it's the inverse of 35% residential and 65% commercial, including the downtown. So in the transit triangle, it was identified that reducing the amount of required commercial and providing more opportunities for ground floor residential may incentivize the development as envisioned.
Thanks,
Okay.
Brandon.
Okay, so what else do we have to tackle?
Yeah, so some areas that you can offer, feedback. I know that you've got more on your agenda tonight. But we've got these auto-oriented and large-scale uses, considering if there's any changes that you want to make to the commercial and employment uses at this time.
Okay, do you want to tackle that? Russell?
So for the auto-orientated and, some of these automotive sales, cabinetry, food product manufacturing, it feels like to me that the Transit Triangle CFA kind of has a different sort of feel than the Railroad District CFA would. And perhaps some of these uses should be allowed in the Transit Triangle CFA, but not in the Railroad District CFA.
So, just to clarify, it's railroad property, not railroad district,
Yeah.
because they're two different places.
Okay, yeah, Railroad CFA, thank you.
Yeah, and I had heard that comment was passed along to me, and to say in code, we can certainly make that distinction between the two CFAs, if that's the direction we hear.
Okay. Susan?
I agree. They are two very different places, and I believe we would not be doing our job if we didn't reflect that. I do think the automotive uses is an interesting point and one worth keeping on our radar screen. Ashland's the first place you hit when you come over the mountains from California. But I don't believe we want it to be the
truck stop?
yeah, I mean, the truck stops are farther north, the local services for automotive repair and sales and so forth are certainly something that are important to have. But I do think it's pertinent to keep an eye on that. Again, I do think that artisanal food products are a totally different category, and they're are attractive and are profitable and make Ashland interesting when you have Julia Child's favorite chocolate and things like that in Ashland. Carrie?
So I agree that the two spaces, the transit triangle and the railroad property, are really different. But I also, and this is just intuitive, so it's not based on anything other than I think that the market, because you have Ashland Street, which is really large and very close to the freeway, I would imagine that more of those auto-oriented, large-scale uses will gravitate there versus the railroad property, even though the railroad property doesn't exist as a place yet, really. But it's still got smaller access points. It's got more residential around. They're different places, and I would think that they would almost be self-selecting. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, I like the comment about them being self-selecting, and I would just offer that I think it's important for us to maintain viability for the services that need to be provided for those people who do own automobiles and want them to be serviced in Ashland. Otherwise, they're driving to Medford, or driving to Talent, driving to Phoenix, driving to Medford to get their car serviced. So many people are still going to have a vehicle. They're going to need to get it serviced somewhere. So I think we ought to make sure that we're not short-sighted in limiting the viability of that service that I think wants to be provided.
Okay.
I agree, Greg. I could think of the one downtown, and you have all the cars parked out front, and it's not very walkable, and it lacks development, which isn't in the CFA, but it's something like that could happen. The one exception I would encourage us to think about, somewhere along the automotive rental, if car sharing becomes pretty popular, you're going to want to be able to get to a car sharing lot that's walkable to the places you're going to shop and the places you're going to live. So it might be a new definition that we create, some consideration that we think about downrange, because you don't want to put those all the way out by the highway, even no way to get there. But I do think they'll self-select a lot of them. There's a lot of flat land that we could park cars and have steel buildings and shops. They don't need to be in the CFAs like we're talking about. But I just would keep in mind, maybe we can carve something out for that.
It's an interesting comment. SOU played with car sharing. I think Zip was the car company that they went with. This was 4 or 5 years ago. I think the pandemic and other things may have influenced the viability, but excuse me, I like that some folks are already playing with the idea. So it's an interesting comment.
Okay, so we don't want to limit auto-oriented uses.
Right.
Right? Okay. So let's move on to large-scale storage uses. Do we want to limit those?
By the way, I disagree on that.
Okay.
I agree. I think we do want to limit it. I think we want to carve out some micro businesses like car sharing that could work, but I don't know if we want car sales, gas stations.
On every corner?
Well, in the designated areas that we're saying we're wanting to be dense and walkable and livable.
Well, I think this is saying, in our general zoning code, do we want to further limit, do we want to limit auto-oriented uses? Is that what we're saying? Not just in the CFA?
This is specifically to CFA
CFAs.
areas.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so for instance, storage is outright, or is a allowable use within E1 zones. Should storage as a low employment generator be allowable in CFA areas as furthering the objectives of the
Okay.
pedestrian friendly,
Okay,
for lack
that
of a better
changed my
term?
perspective. Okay.
Yeah, but we're still talking about the auto part, correct?
I think limiting gas stations, car washes, tire stores. I think about, Les Schwab. I think about our only oil change place. I think about the gas stations near the freeway. And I think all of that, if I'm not mistaken, falls within the new CFA boundaries.
Don't believe they extend to the gas stations at the freeway interchange, but you're right about Les Schwab and Oil Stop. Those are within the CFA. And I believe also the Shell, or I think it just changed to a Sinclair on Siskiyou Boulevard, would be in the CFA area.
So, I mean, I agree in wanting to keep more of that out of the CFAs, but it's like I think about my life, and I drop my car off at Les Schwab, I go work out at the Y, I take advantage of all those things that are walkable. Because it's there, I can do that, and I don't have to drive somewhere further away. So there's got to be another way to create a limitation that doesn't exclude things that actually make things work better. So I don't think it almost feels like it needs to be a little bit finer tooth comb process of looking at it. And yeah, I mean, I don't see those places as making it less walkable. I see them as making it be able to be walkable. So it's kind of a.
Well, it's good that you're giving us a real-life example.
Here I am.
Susan?
But limit doesn't mean none, and it doesn't necessarily mean less than what we have today,
Right.
correct? So it's about balance, in my view, and there is a large storage place hidden back there off of Mistletoe Road, in which I have 3 storage units.
But
I'm just saying, as an example, we're on number 2. But the point is whether we should consider whether to limit, not to make a decision today to limit them or eliminate them, correct?
Correct.
I would assume any current use gets to stay the way it is.
Yeah, but we don't want to make them non-conforming either, because that doesn't help the business at all.
can we say that other than car sharing rentals, we would keep sales and rentals out of that area? Can we do it that way and back into it? You know, at least
Yeah.
knock some of it off the
Yeah,
list.
yeah.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Eric, do you want to?
No, I think we're going to get into this in the walkability. There was a lot of stuff in there about queuing up and drive, not these aren't drive-throughs, but just queuing up for a car wash, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it had to be on a certain kind of property with certain kind of entrance and exits, not just wholesalely how it's been allowed in the past. So some of it might get cleaned up with higher standards around what they would have to do to their property. And we also skipped over drive-up uses. So, one thing I did read in the walkability was like, there are requirements in some cities. You have drive-up use. You also have to have a walk-up or bike-up
Window,
use.
Yeah.
And so as those buildings get remodeled and their drive-through gets renovated and readjusted, kind of like happened to Starbucks, there's a requirement for this so that you're catering to people that are walking. Dutch Brothers does a really good job of this. They always have a walk-up window now in their newer facilities.
Okay.
But that could be an added thing that we would require when you choose to go in for a major update on your drive-through.
Okay, so we can postpone continued discussion on this issue until the walkability section? Do we want to talk about large-scale storage uses, or?
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is they don't belong in CFAs, period.
Yeah.
Because they make dead community spaces, and if you drive through LA and you see these large areas where there's all these storage units, and it's dead. So,
I would agree, but it's sometimes a mixed use. You might have 2 or 3 apartment buildings, and you might have a lower level or a sub-level that is storage that they
within that building.
will rent to the neighbors and stuff like that. It just happens to be, when you live dense, you might need,
So
there
if
might
it
be a
was
carve
part
out.
of a mixed-use
Absolutely,
situation, yeah,
absolutely.
that's a little different.
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, go ahead.
So the difference between large.
I guess my only concern with the self-storage is that we have existing self-storage in what will become the CFA. And so I just want to be really clear, if we exclude self-storage and we create a CFA, does this then cause this place to go out of business with all these people that have storage in those units?
I think that Chair Werner was on point in that if a use is no longer listed as a permitted use, it becomes a non-conforming use. And it is, in that sense, grandfathered because it was built in accordance with the allowance under the zone. But that would limit potential expansion or other changes that would further intensify that use.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying, Brandon.
Okay, so let's move on. Okay, let's move on. Are there any other, you changed the slide, okay, townhouses.
Oh, sorry, you meant, wrong direction. There we go. Yeah, any thoughts about the industrial and employment uses, I guess, before we move on?
And these
Again, no requirements to change these, just for consideration.
And you're suggesting, you're offering us the opportunity to make changes to C1 and E1 in CFAs.
Correct. Pointing out, questioning whether these continue to be compatible with the mix of uses proposed for CFAs.
Okay, so what we're setting up then is there's an E1 zone. This app has a CFA overlay, and potentially you can't do food product manufacturing in this part of the E1, but you can do it in this part of the E1. Is that where we're
Correct,
going?
or there could be other limitations on food product manufacturing, or any of these others, say a size limit or a conditional use requirement, or, I think at this point it's really just hearing does this seem like a potential impact that you would like the code to address? And, hearing what your concerns are, then we can propose some specific zoning techniques.
Okay.
I kind of have a sensitivity to this one because some of these things can happen in a really beautiful building and have really good air filtration systems and no smells, no sounds come out. And the definition of industrial isn't really in this town limited to square footage. So it's by the use, and if you make something or produce something, it's not by 30 employees or 100,000 square foot building. So I think if we put too many restrictions on this, you can stall out good jobs that are needed and can be built really decently, as long as they're not through noise pollution, sound pollution, light pollution, bothering their neighbors.
So it's great. And one of the things I was thinking is that all you have to do, or one of the ways you could approach this, is by putting size limitations on all those forms of manufacturing within the CFA so that it doesn't overwhelm the zone.
So are you talking about incubator businesses, that kind of?
I mean, it could be just a single owner operated, so it doesn't. So incubator, a lot of times in my mind is a rent. Someone's renting a cheap space.
Yeah.
So this could be owner operated.
Build your own building and.
Yeah, we have
you-
Ethos Tea here. They make tea, like they don't bother anybody, and it's food production.
Or chocolatiers. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Eric. I don't think I don't see value in limiting these 3 examples.
And I would just add that I'm sure you have nuisance laws for noise and things like that that would cover some of those issues that may come up with any manufacturing.
Yeah, there are some in code already, and so I can just, this is exactly the kind of feedback that's useful, and I can work on tailoring some of the existing code and ways to address impacts to make sure that it helps make these type of uses that, as you say, can provide some jobs and be really beneficial and be done well, just to make sure that they are done well for the CFAs. So, thanks.
Susan?
And I would just add, I think seeing the economic development plan would be useful to understand what there is a real demand for or market for here before we go too far.
Yeah. Okay, we're moving on to, what are we moving on to? Townhouses?
Yeah, this was just really to give you some more information about townhouses because they are a new use. If you have any initial feedback, reflections on this was your chance really to ask questions and for me to understand if there's any other concerns about townhouses that you would like to see addressed through the standards.
Go for it.
I like the ideas that you've presented, Elizabeth, for limiting the townhouses and the CFAs. I think, having these types of residential in our city centers is kind of it's a stretch from what we have had in the past. And so I think that having these types of for lack of a better word, restrictions is going to make it an easier transition potentially.
I think the rear loaded building design is definitely the way to do it as well. I think it should be part of a standard.
So, I'm not particularly in favor of townhouses in the downtown, but I do think they have a place in both of our CFAs, in the Railroad CFA and the Transit Triangle CFA.
And that's where they're proposed.
Yeah.
Is only CFAs.
Okay, let's move on.
Great. All right. Last is thinking about some solar setbacks and or whether you're interested to use the height step back option.
Oh, I think the height step back option is good, and we should be using it. And I think it works, I mean, it looks, well, can't really tell, but I think it makes sense to do it at over 2 feet, over 2 stories. And I guess it's because I don't want a 60-foot wall along Main Street. I think, well, I don't know, maybe I do. Okay. Let me pause on that. Somebody else want to talk?
I think that if you do it in relationship to other buildings, it makes a lot of difference to have solar. So we already have step back rules for in residential situations where you're stepping back 10 foot for every story on rear property lines and various different ways of doing it. And I think even though I don't necessarily like the look, if you start to think about pyramidal
Wedding cake,
Huh?
wedding cake, not pyramid.
Well, same thing. In the way I'm, sorry, wedding cake, it's, if you make them tall enough, it's pyramidal. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think that light is important to everybody,
Yeah.
so.
I agree, and related to that, kind of connecting back to the townhouses, you know, classically what makes townhouses really work in urban settings is stoops, balconies, windows, things that connect what's inside to the outside
Yeah.
and make that part of the life that's going on. And I don't think we have that today in the mixed-use buildings that are downtown. And my observation is maybe they're coloring our view of what townhouses can or could be. But step backs, it's certainly a start in that regard to me.
I mean, I think by your slide here, it would be pretty tough to get a commercial piece of property, build a 50-foot tall building, and maintain solar setbacks. Is that what you're showing here? Yeah.
This graphic is specific to the height step backs, not to the solar setbacks, which would be, as you say, even more significant by the time you got up to 50 feet. You know, depending on the angle in which property line, you know, Brandon, I tried to read the tables. I couldn't calculate the exact numbers, but they got pretty high.
No one can.
Yeah. I mean, they got well over 40 or 50 feet. There were some cases it looked like it would be as much as a 100-foot setback. And at that point, you're really not going to build to 50 feet. And so there were some concerns.
I would note that our solar setback ordinance was largely designed to ensure that 21-foot tall residential structures did not cast a shadow on their northern residential property. The application within commercial areas or very dense multifamily that has 3 or more stories typically requires a bigger separation between the buildings and from the north property line, shifting all buildings to the south, which, you know, in the case of the transit triangle area along Ashland Street, you don't have a lot of opportunity on the north side of that street to shift buildings far enough back to the south without hitting Ashland Street in order to accommodate 4-story tall buildings. So.
Russell?
I think in CFAs, we should eliminate or severely limit the solar setbacks. The goal here is density, and we're building tall buildings. I think we should build them next to each other, except for next to residential. I think that the step backs are a good idea, and 10 feet every 25 feet is probably applicable.
Yeah, I agree, Russell. So like the perimeter of it would be limited to solar setbacks of the CFA?
Yes.
Okay, okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's good feedback.
Okay. What else?
I think you're there. The last bullet point is just about design standards, which hopefully will cue you up to your next presentation pretty well. So if there's anything else I can answer specific to CFAs, I'm available, but we'll keep working on refining this before we bring it back to you in a revised draft.
Okay, I think we have one more question.
I think for design standards, maybe Susan had some good input on townhouses.
You remember what that was?
Well, again, to create outdoor spaces as part of the townhouse. I mean,
Oh, like porch and-
classic, you know, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, townhouses work because people relate to their neighbors and relate to the city rather than being inside walls and grass and
Brownstones and that kind of
so
stuff.
forth. I mean, another thing that comes to mind too, developments like the Avalon developments that you see in places such as Atlanta, Austin, so forth. This is all building by building, lot by lot, it seems to me. And even some of the past developments were a little bit more neighborhoody in taking into account, if you consider the difference between, the Avalon development that I'm familiar with, just north of Atlanta, where there is a very thriving community that includes a grocery store, restaurants, housing, all these things in one place. You might imagine where market of choice is as being something more like that. But if everything is approached on a building by building basis, I'm not sure how we do otherwise, but I just would raise the question, is there a way to think more holistically about the CFAs to achieve a different result than, again, parcel by parcel?
So it sounds like that's the difference between a CFA that would be an overlay out at the Croman site, where you could actually develop a community that way, versus trying to apply CFAs to existing
Retrofit,
urban environments.
Maybe.
But the railroad district's the same way. I mean, not the railroad district, but the railroad property is available to that.
The railroad property is one of, I think, 19 parcels within the designated CFA, the largest of which, and a number of others are in various states of development or undeveloped, but there are 18 other properties in there with different ownership.
Okay, so let's move on to walkability.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brendan, would you like us to just jump right in?
Sure. Go for it.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll keep your excitement and energy high here. I think there's a lot of things we just were speaking about, and excited to get a chance to walk you through more of them now. So my name is Pauline. I'm here to talk to you tonight about the Walkable Design Standards Code Audit. Quick overview of what we're going to talk through tonight. Got to have a brief overview just of CFEC and to help you focus in on our particular aspect of CFEC that we're speaking to you about. Introduce the idea of walkable design standards, and then spend a fair amount of time walking you through our code audit findings and the concepts. And we have all of those written out in the memo, which is in your packet, and we'll be walking you through a handful of those concepts in more detail. And then we'll have a chance for discussion and questions after that. I'm Pauline Ruegg. I'm a urban planner based in Portland, Oregon. I'm a senior associate at Cascadia Partners. And I'm joined tonight also by Jamin Kimmel. He's a principal in charge here, also in Portland. And then we have one other member of our team. So the three of us have been, are dedicated to this code audit project. And we also were lucky enough to help staff the model code project with the LCD. So a lot of experience around this topic. A little bit about CFEC up front, and I apologize if some of this is redundant, but to me it's always helpful. It's a very expansive set of state rules, and sometimes I get lost in those state rules. So it's always helpful to me to just remind ourselves, what are we specifically looking at? So within CFEC, there's many different aspects, all looking at trying to change land use and transportation planning in order to have those healthier, equitable, more climate-friendly communities. So there's parking reform, there's transportation system plans, there's climate-friendly areas that we were just talking about. But we are looking specifically in this project at Rule 0330 primarily, and a small portion of Rule 0405. And those sets of rules within the CFEC rules are addressing land use regulation, and specifically directing jurisdictions to regulate land use to support compact, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use land use and development patterns. So the charge of this project is to look at those rules and to do a comprehensive code audit for the city of Ashland, develop a set of concepts. That's what we've been doing for the last several months, and we're meeting you for the first time tonight to present what we found in our code audit and concepts. After some feedback from you and staff, we'll finalize those concepts and move really quickly here into drafting code amendments, which we'll be bringing back to you in the spring. Then we'll turn those over into final code amendments, and the idea is to package a set of amendments along with the amendments that 3J was walking you through this evening, and Elizabeth, to be packaged together with both the CFA and the CFEC aspects together. Separately, I do want to mention that we're beginning to work on some community engagement, which is primarily going to be some education out materials about the content, and that will be shared with the public, but also we're going to reach out specifically to stakeholders to get their feedback on these code ideas so that we can inform code from actual users of the code and build in their opinions to how the changes and code amendments would affect projects. So again, really high level, who's required to make these changes and be compliant with CFEC? It's the 8 largest metropolitan areas, including Ashland, statewide. So we're looking at major changes across the state at how land use and transportation planning is handled. When our city is required to do that, it's when on or before a major TSP update. So in the case of Ashland, currently just about to begin that TSP update, and anticipating doing that from 2025 to 2027. So at that point, the city of Ashland is required to be compliant with Rule 0330, and that's why we're doing this project in order to provide the code amendments to be compliant with 0330. It's very important to clarify up front that the Rule 0330 is looking at the private lot. So if you look at this diagram, it's looking at everything here from the left. It's looking at the building and where it meets that property line coming up to the public right-of-way. So the land use regulations are not addressing the sidewalk, the streets, right? Now, those are all very consequential for the experience of place and how a city functions and feels. But those are aspects that are being addressed in the transportation system plan. And really the big idea behind CFEC is to look at both land use and transportation. But in this rule and the code amendments that we're looking at, we're only looking at the private lot. I just want to make that clear. And it is incremental. So what any code amendments would be affecting future development or redevelopment, and they wouldn't be affecting existing development on the ground today. So the rules are applied across the entire urban growth boundary. So all of the area within city of Ashland, with the exception of areas of industrial and rural character. So I just have highlighted on the slide for you here all of the relevant zones that within our code audit we looked at. So a very comprehensive look across your code. And then of course, there's also relevant standards related to streets and other things that we also looked at. So we really looked at your code from start to finish in order to bring it up to consistency here. And as we've started to allude to tonight, there is some overlap between design standards that would address 0330 as opposed to the requirements in 0320, which Elizabeth was speaking through, and that's really more on the land use side of things. So we're not looking at the land use, we're looking at the design standards. I'll make that clear in a little bit here. So the rules broadly look at compact, walkable design, but what does that mean? When we break it down, what is walkable design? The rules are very broad around that. There's not specific requirements. The CFA has very specific requirements about what cities must do. Rule 0330 is fairly wide open. So we start from a place as we're looking at your codes in terms of what are the outcomes, what are the types of environments, how somebody moves through a space, and how people of all types will move through a space and have the choices in terms of how they get someplace where they want to go, and what that experience is like. So the OARs, again, are asking cities to look at their land use regulations to support those compact, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use patterns. So DLCD developed a walkable design standards guidebook and a model code, and that is the tools that cities have to use in order to look at their existing land use regulations. And the guidebook helps cities to understand what are those desired outcomes. What does that look like? It's a connected network of streets and access ways so that people can choose to ride their bike someplace, walk down the sidewalk to get to someplace, and easily get to the front door. It's so that they can move easily and safely through a neighborhood and get to all those key destinations. So that's what we're looking for as the objective, and then we apply that to your actual code. I want to take a minute to say a little bit more about the model code. So the model code was the benchmark that we used. We have the rules that set the intent and the objectives, and then the model code is the benchmark that we can take and compare to the City of Ashland's existing code. The model code represents one way that a city can be consistent with the OARs. It's not the only way, but it does translate the rules into specific design standards that do seek to achieve that more walkable, transit-oriented development pattern that the rules is seeking. And it also reflects best practice approaches. So one thing to highlight is all the standards in the model code are written as clear and objective standards, whether for residential or non-residential uses. And that is both for the ease of applicants, but also for the ease of staff as they're reviewing applications that come in. So the model code is really that benchmark which sets the bar for what cities should and could aim for. So in this project, as part of the code audit, we really looked at comparing existing land use regulations in the city of Ashland, so Title 18, and comparing it to the relevant rules, which are Rule 0330 and 0405, and to the model code to check for consistency. So is the existing, is a relevant standard in the city of Ashland consistent with those rules? Is it consistent with that model code? In areas where we found an inconsistency, we've highlighted those in the code audit memo that you have. And for every section that is not consistent, we've highlighted a proposed concept for you all to consider in terms of how to address that inconsistency. Now, code concepts are really a proposal or an idea to help you think through how the city could update its existing land use regulations to better achieve those walkable design outcomes. And as I mentioned before, it's not one way to do it. The rules, again, provide flexibility so that a city can, within its existing character and context, within its existing rules and regulations, has some choices available as to how it wants to go about updating its standards to be more consistent. So one thing to note is if we identified a standard in the title that was not consistent with the rules, then it is a requirement that the city must update that standard on or before the time when you're updating the TSP. If there's a standard that was not consistent with the model code, we'd highlight that as an opportunity where the city may choose to update the standard, but it's not a requirement because it is consistent with the rule. It's just not consistent with this model code as a benchmark. So I just want to underscore the flexibility that the city has in terms of choosing how to go about updating its land use regulations. And we're going to walk you through those. And those are really the types of choices that we want to highlight. So what are the areas that are important to the city and to the commissioners in terms of those walkable design outcomes? And then how do you go about actually amending design standards to get those walkable outcomes? So generally, stepping back and looking across Title 18, the city is not only consistent with the rules, but really frequently goes above and beyond even what is in the model code. So really want to commend the city for how much effort has been put clearly into the code over the years to regulate and seek those walkable design outcomes. You know, I have just a couple examples up here. But, you know, for example, how the city of Ashland regulates drive-through uses and really has capped that total number, the number of special districts that encourage the use of alleys, how streets are required to connect at a larger network scale, the actual street designs themselves, a lot of design standards that require buildings to come up to the edge of the sidewalk, be oriented to the street. There's really a lot of these design standards that are encouraging that type of pedestrian activity by requiring building design that is welcoming and creates this really enjoyable street environment, and also a street environment that is easy for someone to move through, not only by way of a car, right? But there's other ways that they could walk or ride a bike, use a scooter to get around places. So really across the board, Title 18 is highly consistent with both the rules and the model code. Now, to highlight a couple of areas, we found 3 areas in which the existing standards today in Title 18 are inconsistent with the OARs. And again, I want to point out this is an interpretation of the OARs, but these are areas of Ashland's code that we found were not meeting the objectives for commercial and residential zones. So the first is, today there's no current limitation on the width of garages. So if you're looking at the front of a house, there's no limitation on the width of that garage as a proportion of the total building facade. There's also no requirement for garages to be set back further, so they can be at the same or even in front of, let's say, the front door of a house. And then lastly, there are no entry requirements in terms of the orientation for single detached and duplex homes. So let me walk you through those in a little bit more detail and give you some visual examples here so you could see. So the basic, just to orient you to the slide, the basic setup is on the left-hand side is what would be permitted today to be developed based on the existing regulations that you have in your land use code. And then on the right is a concept which demonstrates how development could be potentially developed in the future if you were to make the changes that are itemized underneath it. So, garage width and setback. Currently, without that limitation on the width of garages, a garage, as you can see here, it takes up a very large percentage of the overall front facade. Also, it's actually set in front of those living spaces or those kind of social aspects of a house. If you contrast that with the development on the right-hand side, the garage is a smaller proportion of the overall facade, so it's much less visually prominent. Also, that front living space is pushed forward. So what is closer to the sidewalk is that porch. And so this is more of the social development pattern that the state is looking for in the rules, where there's more opportunities for someone to interact with the people that live in that house, rather than the example on the left, where really they're interacting with a driveway and an auto-oriented space. And it doesn't feel nearly as sociable or really as safe for a pedestrian to walk by. Here, in terms of entry orientation, on the left-hand side, you can see a development where the largest street-facing facade, this area here, has no entry on it, right? The entry is over here on the side of the building, oriented to this common driveway. And that's allowed today for a single detached home or a duplex. Contrast that instead with an entry orientation standard that requires all residential building types to have entries facing the street, and they could be at a 45-degree angle, or they could also open onto a porch. So in contrast, this entrance here in this image would need to be on the front of this building face here, or it could be on the corner here at an angle of 45 degrees, or it could open onto a porch. So pausing, and there's a lot of material here, so I'm really looking forward to the opportunity for you all to ask questions and walk through this with us. So next, I want to highlight for you some opportunities for the city to consider some options that you may want to amend your code. So one universal finding that we found in the code audit was across Title 18, there's a lot of opportunities to make your design standards more clear and objective. First of all, that's a requirement for design standards that are applied to residential uses. But there's just opportunities when the standards are made clear and objective to be very specific and detailed and break down what it is that the city would like to have as a design outcome, and that leaves it much less open to interpretation and getting, as an applicant could come in arguing that something does something. When it's clear and objective, it's very specific what they need to do, and it's a better opportunity for the city to really get those good design outcomes. We also noted a lot of amendments related to the street network and connectivity, and we've highlighted those for the city as code amendments that could be taken up as part of your TSP update. So that a lot of that relates to driveways and overall street connectivity and the street network. So we've highlighted those in the memo. What I'd like to present to you tonight are 3 key concepts really related to a lot of the topics that we were just discussing in the CFA areas, which are related to pedestrian-oriented design standards. So we're not looking at the uses, we're looking at the design standards that would apply to uses as they're developed in areas. So I'd like to talk to you about pedestrian-oriented design standards for residential uses. And then there's those within your basic site review. Then there's the residential uses that may, as we talked about tonight, start to be developed more widely across CFAs. And then lastly, there's design standards for ground floor of non-residential uses. So let me walk you through each one of those, again, with some visual examples. So in your current code today, there's a detailed site review overlay. There's also special districts. And in those overlays, there's a whole set of design standards that are applied across uses. And so any use, any development that's within that overlay, and as they come in for site review, they need to meet all of these individual design standards. So I've listed them out here. Contrast that with a project outside of that detailed site overlay, then that development needs to meet a more basic set of site design standards. And there's a specific set applied to residential uses. So I just want to highlight for you, as we were looking through the audit, the question that was raised for us is, are there any standards in this set of detailed site design standards that may be applicable and that the city may want to apply to residential uses that would improve the pedestrian-oriented nature of those residential uses? And I think this helps highlight, if you look at across the city, the residential zones today that permit multifamily dwellings, and again, the city of Ashland has a fairly expansive definition, I put it down here, of what a multifamily dwelling is. It's any more than 3 units on a lot and attached common wall dwellings. So these are the residential zones I've highlighted today that permit multifamily dwellings. And you can see a lot of these areas here where residential uses are permitted, but there's no detailed site overlay standards applied on top of them. There's no special district standards. And so these would be areas today where just the basic site design standards apply. And in our code audit, we found that the model code has relevant design standards related to transparency and the transitions of that ground floor residential use. I think this is a lot of the comments that the commission was bringing up about those, what makes a townhouse work, what makes it add to the pedestrian environment. These are 2 of those standards that we think that the commission may want to consider adding within its basic site design standards that are applied today to residential uses. Next, we were speaking about within the CFAs. Again, the CFAs are going to be using that detailed design site overlay. If there's more residential uses that begin to come to be developed within those CFAs, it sounds like there is an interest from the commission and the city to look more closely at the types of design standards that are important to apply to those residential uses so that they're continuing to activate the street and really contributing to those compact urban mixed-use districts within the CFAs. So I want to highlight here for you the visual examples of the type of standards that this commission could consider. On the left, this is in those residential areas today with only the basic site design standards applied. This type of project could be developed. So there's a requirement that the building be oriented to the street. So here there's no parking in front of it. The windows are facing the street. It is connected by walkways. Each of these is an individual walkway. And there's some street trees. Now I would contrast that with the image on the right, where there's a transparency standard, 15 to 25%, which is met here both with these transom windows and this higher windows up in the door and some windows here in the front of the unit. But there's also really critically this transition space, which is the zone of 5 to 10 feet on that ground floor where there's required design elements to create some of that buffer and transition. And that transition is as important for the residents who live here, right? That gives them a sense of removal and some privacy from people walking by their home. But it also really adds to the street environment. And there's things for people to look at and engage and interact with as they walk by. So those are some really critical elements of design standards to address those ground floor residential units if they begin to be developed more across the city. So the last thing I want to highlight is looking at areas of commercial uses today, those detailed site design standards that apply. We did find in our code audit, there's still some aspects of pedestrian-oriented design where the city may want to go further and think about clear and objective design standards. I want to highlight for you two aspects there that we were considering or would put to your consideration. So again, transparency and weather protection. So today, the detailed site overlay design standards do require transparency. They require any wall within 30 feet of a street, plaza, or public or common open space to have at least 20% of that wall area facing be transparent. But I would show this to you in terms of 20% is significantly below the model code standard, which is what's shown on the right here, which is 50 to 75% of the total wall area along the ground floor is required to be transparent. So that higher transparency percentage is promoting much more a sense of interaction and really allowing people walking by those commercial uses to see what's going on inside and again, activate and engage that pedestrian realm. On weather protection, there is a requirement that buildings incorporate arcades, roofs, alcoves, porticos, and awnings, but this is a good example of a clear and objective standard. Now, the intent is there to provide that weather protection, but the model code standard would call instead for a clear and objective 50 to 75% of the length of the ground floor is required to provide weather protection of a certain height and depth. And the intent there would be to support the use of that sidewalk in all weather conditions, whether there be snowstorms or recently it's been pouring rain in Portland. This summer it will be hot and sunny, right? So through all the different seasons, there's really protection over that sidewalk to really encourage pedestrians to use that space regardless of the weather. So I'm going to pause there and open it up to you all. We have a basic set of questions for you, but really open it up to what questions you have, having looked over the memo and seen the presentation. So first, I would ask if you have any questions about the CFEC rules or the model code. Are there any of the code concepts that we presented tonight that you have major concerns about or that you'd like to raise issues related to? And then of the concepts that we were walking you through, what issues related to walkable design are really a high priority for your Planning Commission that you'd want to make sure we're considering as we're looking at potential amendments for these design standards? And with that, I'll hand it back to the commission. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. One of the things that just caught me while you were speaking was the whole idea, and I think it was just semantic, but I want to make sure, of orientation to the street. And that's great if you are on a street frontage, but when you actually think about other ways of designing groupings of houses where they may be oriented to a central public space instead of to the street, I just want to make sure that that language is in there as well.
Yes, absolutely. Understood. Thank you. And the model code is very clear about this. It applies specific standards to buildings within 20 feet of a street or facing a common courtyard.
Okay.
Absolutely understood.
You're talking about like cottage house.
Huh?
Well, I think the concepts that you laid out were very clear. I think the way they're presented is good, and I think in essence, I have no concerns about anything that you presented. I think each issue is very understandable, and I think what would add to the urban landscape, if you want to call Ashland an urban landscape.
One other thing that comes up for me is just looking at the transparency, which I totally agree with all of the concepts you put forth. But if we're also trying to look at promoting affordability, some of these things are in direct conflict. So how does that get straddled?
Yes, something our firm has worked on in the past, and part of the reason we like to do stakeholder engagement is to specifically interact with the development community around changes. So yes, a jump from 20% transparency to 75% transparency could have a significant cost impact. And so it's something that we like to balance. And it's also an aspect of the model code. It has identified ranges, and that's to give jurisdictions a choice and to think through some of those cost concerns. Yes, is 75% something that the local development community thinks would significantly increase project costs and potentially impact development feasibility? That's something that could be taken into account as we're drafting the code amendment. And that's the type of calibration that we'll make as we're writing the code amendments.
The weather protection is not something that I had thought about explicitly, but I do think is very intriguing, not only having gone through a period of extreme weather recently, when walking through downtown was pretty much impossible. Also, having lived in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese shop house design, for example, allows people to get around in poor weather, works very well with mixed-use buildings, which I've expressed some opinions about, but it makes it quite possible, actually, to have that commercial residential mix, and has very strong historical connections, which is something we worry about in Ashland, because part of why those existed historically was when the streets were mud, and the only place where you really would want to walk was under a covered walkway. So to me, that's an idea, you know, all these are great ideas worth exploring, and you presented them very persuasively with your photos here. That one, you know, I think really caught my attention anyway.
Eric?
It caught my attention too, because sometimes I think we go too far on it. Like, it says 50 to 75%. Sometimes it's 100%. And it feels like you're just walking under one random canopy to the next. And we're getting to the point where we almost have 300 days of sunshine here. And we got good trees in a lot of places. I do like the 50 to 75%. But sometimes I walk downtown, and it's just like you feel they're lower, they're kind of over your head a lot more, and I'd like to see the sun every once in a while.
Russell?
Thanks for the presentation. I like the idea of making sure that we're hitting these clear and objective standards and all the code updates to make sure that when we're interpreting this, it's you know, people have a firm idea of what they're shooting for. I think these ranges that we're given, we should probably err on the lower end with a mind towards affordability. But so that we're still hitting our benchmarks, we can always do more. But I think if we set the benchmark a little bit lower, it's going to price more people in.
Susan?
So I do want to say I totally agree with the comments. And also, there is a practical aspect of covered areas becoming places to stay. And that has occurred at my office where people sleep overnight, sometimes under a covered walkway, certainly the bus stops and so forth. So that is a practical consideration we have that Singapore doesn't. But, again, all about balance really and making it work, I think.
Eric?
And I don't know if it would be addressed here or some kind of street standard, but especially moving forward in these areas where it's going to be more dense. Our downtown, once again, not in one of these areas, but the ability to park a bike is pretty random, and a lot of times it's in the walkway. A lot of times it's just a tree. And I would encourage us to look at something standard, even if it was a bump out on city property or something standard where you can still walk from place to place and not trip over the bikes because there's nowhere to put them.
If I may, that's a really good example of the type of areas of overlap with that transportation system plan. And absolutely, right, we might look at how someone's walking through that space, but that's an aspect of how they got there. And that's also critically important and the type of thing that the TSP can look at supporting. So thanks for bringing up, that's a really good example of all the different areas within a city, how we talk about connectivity and walkability and bikeability.
And if I could just clarify to Commissioner Herron's point, these walkability standards, design standards would apply within the entirety of the urban growth boundary, not just in the climate-friendly areas, although they'd apply there as well.
Anybody else have anything? I guess not. You wowed us.
I'll take credit for that and not the time of evening it is. Well, I think there'll be opportunities the next time we come to speak with you. We'll be presenting draft code amendments. We'll be taking these concepts and translate them into specific code language, at which point we'll also be supporting those with some graphics and give the commission another chance, another opportunity to provide some input into how those code amendments are actually written in all the content. But thank you very much for your time tonight, and we appreciate your input and feedback. Look forward to the chance to speak with you again.
Thank you very much. Thank both groups. So, Brandon, where are we?
That concludes these two items on the agenda, and then I think we are back to you whether there's other items from the commission.
Okay. Is there anything for open discussion? Susan?
I would just like to come back to the point that these PowerPoints were, and maybe this is my corporate training, but these PowerPoints to me were much more easy to absorb and understand and do something with mentally than all the written text. So I don't know if it's possible to have those be in the packets, but personally, I would find it really helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is there a way that the consultants can get us something?
Yeah, we've got copies of these PowerPoints. We'll obviously give those to you so that you have copies of those, but I think that your question relates to the next
Yeah.
presentation before you, we'll work with the consultants to see if we can get them in advance in enough time to gain the packet for you.
Or even a couple days ahead, even if it's not the week before. Okay. So, is there a motion to adjourn?
Oh, sorry. Really fast, though. On the topic of walkability, as a representative of the Public Arts Commission, I do think that the linkage between walkability and attractiveness and what public arts is doing, particularly the Playwrights Walk, is something that would be useful to put on the agenda sometime in the near future, because it does relate to why you might walk more or spend more time walking or pause,
Yeah.
during your walk.
Sure, we can. Eric?
Yeah, and I know we don't deal with the transportation, TEC, is that what it was? TSC. Here, but it might be nice to get another presentation closer related to the walkability so that I guess we could see what city council might be looking at for a whole city-wide change and how we layer that in for what the property owners are required.
Sure, the transportation system plan is something that amends our comprehensive plan. So it does come to the Planning Commission for review and recommendation to the City Council. It is a 2-year-long planning process that is beginning to kick off, will not be even initiated before these climate-friendly area standards have to be adopted under state law. So obviously, if there's modifications to street standards that are informed by the work of the walkability, those can be folded into the TSP. Unfortunately, we can't wait until the TSP is completed to implement walkability standards. Of course, we could revise them subsequent if it's informed by that, but.
We can coordinate. Wow. Russell?
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, 9:12. Wow. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Greg.
All right, have a good night.
Good night.